In yoga, we often talk about the eight limbs as if they are separate steps. But what if one limb quietly transforms all the others? What if one subtle practice could shape your awareness, your inner discipline, your reactions, and even your ability to move deeper into yoga? What if this one limb is far more central to the path than most of us realize? Hello everyone. Welcome back to Breath Math. I am Nisha and I'm very glad you are here. So today we are diving into a very important topic, the math of Ashtanga Yoga. When we learn the eight limbs of yoga, very often we learn them one by one, almost like separate topics. But yoga is not really experienced like that. In actual practice, all these limbs are interconnected. One affects the other. Today, we are going to look at how one subtle practice can actually influence the whole path. Not only your practice on the mat, but also your awareness, your discipline, your reactions, and even your ability to go deeper within. Before we begin, just relax, grab a glass of lemon water, and settle in. Now, you may be wondering, what do I mean by the math of Ashtanga Yoga? I'm not talking about math in a literal or rigid sense. I'm talking about understanding the hidden connections within the yogic path and seeing how each limb quietly influences the others. Many times we study these limbs like this. First Yama, Niyama, then asana. Next comes Pranayama and Pratyahara. Then comes dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi. So naturally, we begin to think of them as separate stages. But if you really observe yoga deeply, that is not how it works. These limbs are not isolated compartments. They are interconnected, they are constantly influencing one another. And one of the most important links in this whole equation is pranayama. That is why this episode matters. Because if we understand how pranayama affects the rest of the path, then suddenly yoga starts making much more sense, not just philosophically, but practically. Yoga is not just about postures. I think this is one of the first things we need to understand. Today, many people still relate to yoga mainly through asana. They think yoga begins with posture and maybe ends with posture. But the classical yogic path is much deeper than that. Yoga is really about awareness. It is about understanding the mind. It is about learning how to live with more steadiness. It is about reducing inner disturbances. It is about creating more space between impulse and action. So, if yoga is trying to bring us toward greater awareness and greater steadiness, then obviously the breath becomes very important because breath is one of the quickest mirrors of our inner state. When the mind is disturbed, the breath changes. When emotions rise, the breath changes. When stress increases, the breath changes. When the system becomes calm, the breath also changes. So, breath is not just a side topic in yoga, it is deeply connected to the whole purpose of yoga. Why pranayama is more than a breathing practice? Very often, pranayama gets reduced to breathing exercise, and honestly, this is one of the biggest misunderstandings. Pranayama is not just about inhaling and exhaling in a certain pattern. It is not just about lung capacity. It is not just about relaxation. And it is definitely not just something we do for a few minutes at the end of the class. Pranayama is a way of influencing the whole internal environment because prana underlies both body and mind. Regulating the breath begins to affect much more than breathing alone. It influences the nervous system, mental fluctuations, emotional reactivity, awareness, inwardness, and even the inner conditions needed for meditation and absorption. This is where the math begins to open up. Once breath changes, many other things begin to change with it. And that is why pranayama is not just one part of the system, it becomes one of the most powerful levers in the whole path. How pranayama influences the yamas. Let's look at this more honestly. If a person is constantly stressed, emotionally reactive, restless, and internally disturbed, how easy is it for them to live these principles naturally? It becomes very, very difficult. For example, ahimsa, non-violence, is not just about not harming others physically. It is also about how we respond, how we speak, how reactive we become, and even how harshly we treat ourselves. Slow and conscious breathing reduces reactivity and aggression. It softens the impulse toward harm, not only in action, but even in thought and speech. The same with satya, truthfulness. A clearer, steadier mind sees more clearly. It becomes less defensive, less agitated, less impulsive. That makes honest self observation easier and truthfulness becomes easier. When prana flows more freely, the impulse to take what is not ours begins to diminish. A full breath becomes a reminder that what we need is not always outside us. Then comes brahmacharya. Pranayama not only gathers and regulates energy but also moves it upward. It helps supplement vital energy, refine it, and redirect it with awareness rather than allowing it to remain scattered or constantly pulled outward by restless sensual urges. And the last one, the aparigraha, non hoarding or non grasping. This one is very beautifully connected to the breath because when there is inner holding, the breath often reflects that. There is tightness, incompleteness, a subtle habit of grasping. But when the breath becomes fuller and more balanced, especially when release becomes more natural, something in our inner tendency to cling also begins to soften. Each exhale is a letting go. Again and again, the breath trains the mind to release attachment instead of holding on. So, what am I trying to say here? I'm saying that pranayama supports ethical living not only philosophically but physiologically. It creates an internal state from which the yamas become more natural. How pranayama influences the niyamas. Now let's talk about the niyamas, the personal observances. Again, these are often taught as beautiful concepts. Socha, Santosha, Tapas, Svadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhan. But pranayama gives them a lived dimension. Saucha is not only about outer cleanliness, it is also the cultivation of inner clarity. Through pranayama, the system begins to cleanse itself from within. The breath becomes more regulated, the internal rhythm becomes more balanced, and purification happens not only in the lungs and blood, but also through the energetic channels, the nadis. So, in that sense, pranama becomes a very real practice for inner purification. The santosha, contentment, also becomes easier when the nervous system is not constantly agitated. A restless system always feels like something is missing. When breath becomes deeper and more balanced, a natural ease begins to arise and contentment becomes more available. Tapas, discipline is also strengthened through pranayama because the regular practice of pranayama itself becomes tapas. It builds willpower, consistency, and inner fire that is Agni. Svadhyaya or self study is one of the greatest gifts of breath awareness. The moment you begin observing your breath, you begin observing yourself. You start noticing how your breath changes when you're stressed, angry, tired, anxious, or calm. In that way, the breath becomes a mirror, making self inquiry more direct, honest, and embodied. And the last comes Ishvara Pranidhan, surrender. This too is deeply reflected in the breath. With every exhale, there is a letting go of effort, of holding, of ego's need to control. And then comes the pause, where we do not really know, yet we trust that the next inhale will come. In that way, each breath becomes a small act of surrender, reminding us that life is not lived by control alone, but also by trust and grace. So again, pranayama does not sit separately from the path. It enters directly into how these principles are lived. Pranayama and asana. Now let's come to asana because this is where many people think the real yoga practice begins. But even in asana, breath is central. Without breath awareness, asana can very easily become shape making. It can become performance, it can become stiffness, it can become ambition. Breath is what makes asana intelligent. It prevents unnecessary force. It helps the body settle into the posture. It helps the mind stay present. It creates the possibility of stability with ease instead of just effort. And this is important because many people can do postures, but not everyone is practicing yoga through those postures. What makes a difference? Awareness. And breath is one of the strongest anchors of that awareness. So if someone thinks pranayama only matters after asana, I would say no. Even asana begins to change when breath becomes more conscious. Pranayama as the bridge to the inner limbs. Now we come to pranayama in its deeper role within the eight limbs. Even though pranayama is placed as the fourth limb in Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, its effect is not limited to the fourth position. Its influence moves both backward and forward through the entire path. That is why it is so central. From here, the path begins to turn inward. The next limb is Pratyahara, withdrawal of the senses, and this is one of the cleanest downstream effects of pranayama. As the breath slows down and becomes more refined, sensory noise also begins to quiet down. The mind stops chasing external stimulation in the same way, and especially through kumbhaka or breath retention. The senses can begin to withdraw naturally inward. This is why Pratyahara is so often described as the bridge between the outer and inner limbs of yoga. It marks the shift from doing something outwardly to experiencing something inwardly. Then comes dharana, concentration practice. Dharana is deeply supported by regulated breath because when the breath is refined, thought fluctuations also begin to reduce. The mind becomes less scattered, attention becomes steadier. In fact, the breath itself can become an object of focus, training the mind in single pointedness. Practices like Nadi Shodhanam are especially valued here because they help balance the system and support clarity and concentration in a very direct way. And from here, we move into dhyana, meditation. Meditation depends so much on the internal environment. A disturbed system cannot simply switch into meditation just because we decide to sit down. But a calm, slow, and regulated breath creates the neurological and energetic conditions in which meditation can arise more naturally. In that sense, pranayama becomes a real preparation for dhyan. You cannot force meditation, but you can prepare the inner ground for it. And pranayama does exactly that. Finally, we come to samadhi, absorption. Even here, the role of breath is not absent. In fact, the yogic tradition tells us that in deep absorption, the breath becomes extremely subtle and at times may even appear suspended. Systematic pranayam helps prepare for that possibility by gradually refining the whole system and removing the veil that covers the inner light. So, even in the highest limb, breath remains deeply relevant, subtle, refined, but still present in the journey toward union. There is a beautiful line from the Hatha Yoga Pradipika that captures the essence of all of this. When the breath moves, the mind moves. When the breath is still, the mind becomes still. That really is the principle behind everything we have been talking about. Before pranayama, correct breathing matters. Now, this is another very important point. Before we even talk about pranayama techniques, we have to talk about breathing itself. Because if the natural breathing pattern is disturbed, then the pranayama practice also gets affected. And today, many people are not breathing optimally. There is shallow breathing, there is chest dominant breathing, there is rushed breathing. There is incomplete exhalation. There is stress breathing. So the foundation matters. If the foundation is weak, then the higher practices do not land in the same way. This is why correct breathing is not something basic that we skip over quickly. It is actually essential. A person may know many pranayama techniques by name, but if their natural breath pattern is still dysfunctional, then the deeper benefits of the practice remain limited. So, when we talk about the importance of pranayama, we also have to respect the importance of retraining the breath itself. Why this matters in daily life. This is not only about formal yoga practice. This matters in daily life also. Because the way you breathe affects the way you respond. It affects how quickly you react. It affects how much patience you have. It affects how clear your mind feels. It affects your energy. It affects whether you feel grounded or scattered. That means pranayama is not just for yoga teachers, serious practitioners, or people doing advanced spiritual practice. It matters for anyone who wants to live with more awareness, anyone who wants to feel less reactive, anyone who wants more steadiness, anyone who wants to experience yoga as something deeper than posture. Because when the breath changes, daily life changes. And this is what makes this whole conversation so practical. Cracking the math of Ashtanga Yoga. So now, if we bring all of this together, what do we really understand? We understand the 8 limbs are not separate steps in the way we often imagine them. They are connected, and pranayama is one of the limbs that quietly affects the rest. It influences how we live the yamas, it supports the niyamas, it deepens the asana, it initiates the inward movement toward pratyahara, it steadies the concentration, it prepares the ground for meditation, and even in the higher states of absorption, the refinement of breath remains deeply relevant. So, if we are trying to crack the math of Ashtanga Yoga, this is one of the most important equations to understand. When the breath changes, the path changes. And when pranayama is neglected, the whole equation loses something. That is why pranayama is not a minor part of practice. It is not optional decoration. It is not just a breathing break between other practices. It is one of the most crucial elements in the whole yogic journey. So, if there is one thing I want you to take from today's episode, it is this: pranayama is not just a breathing practice, it is one of the key forces shaping how yoga is experienced. It shapes awareness, it shapes inner discipline, it shapes emotional response, it shapes presence, and it helps connect the outer and inner limbs of yoga. So the next time you feel like skipping pranayama, thinking it is less important than asana, or thinking it is just a few extra minutes of breathing, remember this podcast. Remember that one limb may be quietly transforming all the others. And maybe that is the real math of Ashtanga Yoga. Thank you so much for joining me today on Breath Math. If this episode gave you a new way of looking at pranayama, do share it with someone who practices yoga, teaches yoga, or maybe has only understood yoga through the physical lens. I will see you in the next episode. Until then, keep observing, keep learning, and keep honoring the breath.